There is a common assumption that once a habit is built, it becomes easier to maintain, that repetition leads to stability, and stability leads to permanence. But when it comes to financial behavior, the pattern often moves in a different direction, where consistency, instead of becoming easier, gradually becomes more difficult to sustain as time passes, even when the system itself appears to be working. At the beginning of any financial journey, consistency is driven by clarity. The actions are simple, the goals are immediate, and the feedback is visible. Saving a small amount produces a noticeable change. Reducing an expense has a direct and measurable impact. And because of this, each action reinforces itself. The system feels responsive. But as time progresses, the relationship between action and outcome begins to shift. The same effort produces a smaller visible effect relative to the total system. Adding $500 to a $1,000 balance feels significant. Adding $500 to a $20,000 balance feels almost negligible. The math has not changed. The proportional impact has. And this is where the first layer of friction begins to form. Because human perception does not naturally scale with proportional change, it responds more strongly to absolute differences. So even though the system is improving, it begins to feel as though progress is slowing. And when progress feels slower, motivation begins to weaken. Not because the system is failing, but because the feedback loop has changed. This creates a gap between effort and perceived reward, and that gap introduces resistance. Another factor that compounds this effect is the expansion of complexity over time. At the beginning, the system is simple. Income, expenses, and savings exist in a relatively direct relationship. But as the system grows, additional variables begin to emerge. Multiple accounts, different goals, investment allocations, time horizons, tax considerations. Each of these adds a layer of interaction. And with each added layer, maintaining consistency requires more cognitive effort. Decisions are no longer binary. They involve trade-offs. And trade-offs introduce hesitation. This is the second source of friction, not from the difficulty of the action itself, but from the complexity of choosing the action. There is also the issue of diminishing novelty. In the early stages, each step feels new. Each milestone creates a sense of progression. But over time, repetition removes novelty. The actions remain the same, but the experience changes. What once felt like progress begins to feel like maintenance. And maintenance, psychologically, is less engaging than growth, even if the underlying system is still improving. This leads to a gradual decline in emotional reinforcement. And without reinforcement, consistency relies more heavily on discipline, which is a limited resource. There is also a mathematical dimension to this transition. Consistency is not just about repeating actions. It is about maintaining sequences over time. And as time extends, the probability of interruption increases, not because of failure, but because of variability, unexpected expenses, changes in income, shifts in priorities. Each of these introduces the possibility of breaking a sequence. And the longer the sequence, the more opportunities there are for disruption. This means that sustaining consistency over longer periods is statistically more difficult than initiating it. Not because the actions change, but because the environment becomes less predictable. This is where the concept of sequence integrity becomes important. Consistency is not defined by perfection. It is defined by continuity. And continuity can exist even with small interruptions, as long as the system resumes quickly. But without awareness of this, interruptions can be interpreted as failure, which can lead to abandonment of the system altogether. Another subtle factor is the shift in identity that occurs over time. In the beginning, consistency is something that is actively pursued. It requires effort, attention, intent. But as behaviors repeat, they begin to integrate into identity. The system becomes part of how a person operates. And while this integration can strengthen consistency, it can also make deviations more psychologically disruptive. Because a break in behavior is no longer just a break in action. It is a break in identity. And this can create a form of resistance that is not immediately obvious. Either an overcorrection, where the system becomes rigid, or a withdrawal, where the system is temporarily abandoned. Both responses reduce long-term consistency. There is also an interaction between consistency and expectation. As the system grows, expectations tend to increase. Not always consciously, but incrementally. Progress that once felt sufficient begins to feel average. Average begins to feel slow, and slow begins to feel inadequate, even if the underlying growth rate remains stable. This creates a moving benchmark, where the definition of success shifts faster than the system itself. And when expectations outpace reality, consistency becomes harder to justify emotionally, because the perceived reward no longer aligns with the effort. From a systems perspective, what is happening is a gradual transition from externally reinforced consistency to internally maintained consistency. In the early stages, the system provides frequent feedback. In the later stages, that feedback becomes less frequent and less visible, which means that consistency must be sustained without constant validation. And this is where many systems begin to weaken, not because they stop working, but because they stop signaling progress in a way that is easily recognized. The key insight is that consistency does not become harder because the actions become more difficult. It becomes harder because the conditions surrounding those actions change. The feedback loop slows. The system becomes more complex. The environment becomes more variable. And the psychological rewards become less immediate, all of which increase the effort required to maintain the same level of continuity. So the challenge is not to simplify the system back to its original state, but to adjust expectations and structures to match its current form. To recognize that reduced visibility of progress does not mean reduced effectiveness. To design systems that can operate with less attention. And to measure consistency not by perfection, but by the ability to continue despite interruption. Because in financial systems, long-term outcomes are not determined by intensity. They are determined by duration. And duration depends on consistency. Not the kind that feels easy at the beginning, but the kind that persists when the system becomes quiet, complex, and less immediately rewarding. And understanding that shift is what allows consistency to be maintained, not as a temporary effort, but as a stable, long-term structure. And as this transition continues, another layer of complexity begins to emerge, one that is less about external conditions and more about how internal perception adapts to prolonged exposure to the system. Over time, repetition does not just reduce novelty, it recalibrates what feels normal. What once required effort begins to feel expected. What once felt like progress begins to feel like maintenance. And this recalibration, while useful for building long-term habits, also removes the sense of momentum that initially fueled consistency. Because momentum is often tied to change, and when change becomes less visible, momentum begins to fade, even if the system itself is still moving forward. This introduces a subtle psychological shift where consistency no longer feels like advancement, but like obligation. And obligation, even when self-imposed, tends to generate resistance over time. Not immediate resistance, but gradual friction that accumulates in small ways. A skipped contribution here, a delayed action there, each one insignificant in isolation, but collectively capable of altering the trajectory of the system. There is also a deeper interaction between consistency and cognitive fatigue. In the early stages, decisions are limited and focused. But as the system grows, so does the number of decisions that need to be made, even if only occasionally. Reviewing allocations, adjusting strategies, responding to changes in income or expenses. Each decision requires attention, and attention is a finite resource. Over long periods, even well-structured systems can experience drift, not because the framework is flawed, but because the cognitive load required to maintain it increases. This is where simplification becomes a critical counterbalance. Not simplification in the sense of reducing effectiveness, but in reducing the number of decisions required to maintain consistency. Automating contributions, standardizing actions, creating default behaviors that operate without constant evaluation. These adjustments do not change the core system, but they change how much effort is required to sustain it. And by reducing effort, they extend the duration over which consistency can be maintained. Another factor that becomes more pronounced over time is the role of external comparison. As individuals progress financially, their reference points often shift. Instead of comparing to their past state, they begin to compare to others at similar or higher levels. And this comparison can distort perception. Progress that is objectively stable can begin to feel insufficient when viewed against a different baseline. And when perception shifts in this way, consistency can feel less rewarding, even if it remains effective. This introduces an emotional volatility that is not tied to the system itself, but to how the system is interpreted. And over time, this can influence behavior, not through large changes, but through subtle adjustments that reduce consistency, either by increasing risk in an attempt to accelerate progress, or by disengaging due to perceived stagnation. There is also the concept of diminishing urgency. At lower levels of financial stability, urgency is naturally high. The consequences of inaction are immediate and visible. But as the system stabilizes, urgency decreases. The system can absorb small inefficiencies. It can tolerate minor deviations. And while this is a sign of resilience, it also reduces the immediate pressure to act, which means that consistency must be maintained without the support of urgency. And without urgency, actions rely more heavily on structure than on motivation. This is why systems that depend on motivation tend to weaken over time, while systems that rely on structure tend to persist. Because motivation fluctuates, but structure can remain constant. From a mathematical perspective, consistency over long periods begins to resemble probability rather than certainty. Each action has a high likelihood of being completed, but over enough repetitions, even small probabilities of interruption accumulate. This means that occasional breaks are not just possible, they are expected. And when viewed through this lens, the goal of consistency shifts. It is no longer about avoiding interruption entirely. It is about minimizing the impact of those interruptions, reducing their duration, maintaining the ability to return to the system quickly, and preserving the overall sequence despite temporary deviations. This reframing is important because it aligns expectations with reality. It removes the pressure of perfection and replaces it with a focus on continuity. And continuity, over long periods, is what allows systems to function effectively. Another layer that develops over time is the relationship between consistency and adaptability. A system that is too rigid may maintain consistency in the short term, but struggle to adjust when conditions change. A system that is too flexible may adapt easily, but lose continuity. Sustained consistency requires a balance between these two forces. Enough structure to maintain direction, enough flexibility to accommodate change. And this balance is not static. It evolves as the system evolves, which means that maintaining consistency is not a fixed task, but an ongoing process of adjustment. And this process becomes more important as time extends. Because the longer the system operates, the more likely it is to encounter changes that require adaptation. Changes in income, in goals, in external conditions. Each one introduces the potential for disruption. And the ability to integrate those changes without breaking the system is what defines long-term consistency. There is also a shift in how success is defined. In the early stages, success is often measured by milestones. Reaching a certain balance, eliminating a debt, achieving a visible goal. But over time, these milestones become less frequent, and the system transitions into a phase where success is measured by stability, by the absence of disruption, by the ability to maintain direction over extended periods. This form of success is less visible, less celebrated, but more structurally significant, because it reflects the system's capacity to endure. And endurance, in financial systems, is what allows compounding to fully express itself. All of these factors contribute to a single underlying reality. Consistency does not become harder because the process changes. It becomes harder because the context changes. The system evolves from something that provides immediate feedback to something that requires sustained trust, from something that is actively built to something that must be maintained, and from something that is driven by visible progress to something that operates largely in the background. Understanding this transition is what allows consistency to be preserved, not by increasing effort indefinitely, but by adapting the structure to match the system's current state, by reducing unnecessary complexity, by aligning expectations with longer time horizons, and by focusing on continuity rather than perfection. Because in the end, consistency is not a fixed trait. It is a dynamic process, one that must evolve alongside the system it supports. And when that evolution is understood and managed, consistency stops being something that fades over time and instead becomes something that stabilizes, quietly sustaining progress even when it is no longer immediately visible.